welcome everyone to our Change Exchange podcast for ignited change practitioners, keen leaders making change decisions, and front lines dedicated to making tough change happen. My name is Kimberly Shaw, founder and principal consultant at Changeify. We're focused on positive change management and transformation for our global clients. We have people at the center of what we do, and we focus on making change stick. Together with me today is my trusty partner, Nick Kemp from OD Change Consulting, who helps scores of leaders across the UK and Ireland bring in changes that make their business better. Radical, different, and always supportive, he reshapes ways of working with tangible results. I'm excited to have Jim Kerr from Indispensable Coaching with us today. He is a top-rated mindset coach, an 8-time author, just a little bit of writing there, Jim, not a lot, just a little bit, including the Indispensable Leaders Handbook, which I have, by the way, so I can provide testimonial to that. He's a global global management consultant and has worked with such clients such as Chase, Home Depot, GD, Aetna, and many others. So welcome, Jim. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
What an incredible introduction, Kimberly. Thank you. And also thanks for buying the book.
More than welcome. The three of us have been chatting a little bit before our time together today, and we've landed in a few interesting places framed around leadership, of course, what's happening with high tech, and then, of course, our love for systems, however we define them. So, Nick, I thought you could perhaps kick us off today as we deep dive into some of these chats.
Sure, yeah. Well, to build on what we were talking about in terms of our previous conversations leading to today, what we were really talking about was the fact that AI is the latest in a whole string of new technologies which is changing the way in which we work. And in particular, is changing our expectations of how quickly we evolve and how quickly we develop new ways of operating our businesses. And I think we all agreed that this is unlikely to discontinue in the next few months. It's going to continue to be the same, probably for years to come. But then, where I thought we could look today is with all the noise and the hype and the speculation of transformation and the new tools that we've got and what they offer us in terms of better ways of doing things, is there something that we're forgetting about the human dynamics of organizations? What makes our world work? And maybe we could have a quick look at that area. Are we still thinking about our organizations as being places where people live, work, and operate rather than just technology? And particularly from the perspective of leadership, and with Jim here, with that lens to look through, it would be really good to get your thoughts, Jim, on what leaders are now doing differently and maybe what they're not doing as a result of technology coming through.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific set of observations and a great first question. I think the biggest thing that leaders need to keep an eye on these days is sort of the decency aspect of how they lead. How are they treating people? What's that human interaction look like? Are they giving people space to get accustomed to the new technology and the new ways that we're going to be doing work? And I think the leaders that will be most successful going into the future are the ones that are empathetic and can understand what it's like to be in the shoes of the folks that they lead, and make choices in the ways that they lead so that that decency comes across and people feel like they're being seen and heard and understood and all of that. Because I think it's clear that the AI stuff isn't going to come through with very much feeling. It's really kind of lost in translation. So um, how do we fill that gap? I think leaders, it's their responsibility to fill that gap, you know, because like you say, Nick, the technology's not going anywhere. It's just going to continue to evolve.
Jim, I
Right.
really like that reference you make to the word decency. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot as far as, people-centered practice is concerned. And I'm curious your thoughts as to how do we define that? It seems that in some ways, and if you look all around us in the world, right, probably not even that far, away from us, there seem to be a lot of challenges, maybe, to what we might consider to be decent or how we might conduct ourselves with others. I'm interested in your thoughts about what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to get after it is to kind of remember the golden rule. Are we treating people in ways that we'd want to be treated? And I think it starts there. And that's the very first thing I think leaders need to keep top of mind is am I treating the folks that I'm working with in the ways that I'd want to be treated? Am I leading them in the ways that I'd want to be led? And I think it's through that lens that we can apply sort of something that I call the leadership decency acid test. You know, it's something that I actually learned from Harry Kramer, who was the former CEO of Baxter International. Um, I guess it was American Hospital Supply after that, or before that. I kind of forget what what the order of events were. But Harry had this thing going on in the company that he was leading, and he needed to lay off a bunch of people. And one of the business columnists sort of interviewing him after that said, how do you sleep at night? And he said, well, I sleep very well. And he says, how the guy asks him, how can you do that after laying off thousands of people in one fell swoop, And he said, well, I ask myself two questions before I make any kind of major decision like that. And he said, am I doing the right thing? And am I doing the best that I can? And if I can answer yes to both of those questions, then I can sleep at night. So just a couple of sort of stakes in the ground when we talk about decency and what it means is, are we treating people the way we want to be treated? Are we making the right decisions in the right ways? And are we trying our best? And if we can do all those things, then I think we're probably operating decently.
Yeah. I love the analogy and the story behind that, Jim. One of the things that did occur to me too is that this is an increasingly important issue because as we move forward, if everyone has the technology and looking at the speed at which it's going, yes, there'll be the early adopters, but pretty much everyone's going to have this technology. The thing that's going to make the real difference in organizations are the people. They're the people who are either going to be engaged and motivated and creative and or they're not. And that is largely down to leadership. And also, I think there's a question for me about what type of people are we going to have in organisations. We're not going to
Mhm.
have, if you like, these warm, sticky human cogs in a production machine. They're going to go. We're going to have people who are going to be doing more than conveyor belt type of work. What do you think it means for leadership to to lead people whose creativity, maybe in their insight and their inquiry, is going to be their critical skills?
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point uh, there, Nick. The number one thing we've got to do as leaders is keep our own ego in check. We have to remember the leadership's about them and not us. And to your point, the more the workplace becomes one that's going to be inhabited by and reward people who are able to use these tools effectively and to think out of the box, the higher the likelihood that a leader may feel threatened. And I say that because it's very possible you're going to have someone who you're leading who might be smarter than you, who might be able to use the technology more effectively and get more things done, and that can be threatening. So, rather than trying to be defensive and hold that person back, I think it's on the leader to act in ways that leverage that talent and again treat people the way they'd want to be treated and get the most out of folks. And you see it, we've always seen it where a leader, uh, ones that aren't as effective, hold their people down. They're control freaks or micromanagers. And I think, that's dangerous behavior because there's just too many options. And there used to be I think, a limitation, perhaps, depending on where you lived in the world, that uh, kept people locked in because of the geographical requirements. I live nearby, so that's where I work, but that's gone. I mean, we can work anywhere on the planet from any place on the planet, and I think that's something, again, leaders need to be aware of, sensitive to, and act accordingly because you just don't want to alienate really good people. They have ways of moving on very quickly.
Mm.
It's interesting when we talk about, leadership and Jim, you mentioned, the need for leaders in some ways to get out of their own way. And one of the things that we're seeing, especially when we're focused on AI enablement, for example, is that it's emerging in parts of the organization where there isn't clear leadership necessarily. So, right, it's happening in sections or pockets of the organization where we would see maybe more, and I'll say this carefully, natural alignment. So data, right? Technology, those kinds of places. And what we're seeing is some lag, which I think you're pointing to as well in some of the gap where leaders that say are in governance, right? Maybe more placing more senior in the organizations. Um, don't necessarily or need to necessarily bring in those structures, if you will, to be able to lead effectively, given where they may actually even be behind a bit of that curve. Curious as to what our thoughts are about some of the ways in which leaders can lead, but also be, I think what we're saying, accountable and responsible for some of the implications on their leadership that are really contemporary right now. What they did 5 years ago even is probably not going to work in the same ways.
Mm.
Right. I think with the geographic dispersion of talent, we're introducing some interesting challenges. So it used to be that we're all in one place. You can walk down the aisle, you can hop in somebody's office or somebody's cube, you can have a quick conversation, and you can move forward to whatever you're doing that day. Today, with people being all over the place, I think leaders are challenged to figure out ways to build the sort of team atmosphere that I think the three of us came up with, as we were growing in our careers. That model's kind of diminishing. So yes, I think leaders are going to have to become a little more creative in the way they keep people together, how they keep in touch with the folks that they're leading. Um, Certainly technology can help. We're on this Zoom call today and we're in, I think, three different countries, if I'm not mistaken. And, it's working just fine. But again, with the workforce being dispersed, it's going to be on the leader to figure out, ways to have the communication that's necessary to do team building and to leverage all the talent that they've got, you know, under them.
Yeah. That's really interesting. The issue about team and the whole concept of team is one which I find really fascinating.
Mm,
Because we used to look at teams as being a group of people who are geographically close. And there's something about being part of a team which requires you to be close in some aspect.
mhm,
And increasingly I see that organizations are thinking about purpose and trying to identify a shared purpose, which brings us all together, irrespective of where our geography happens to be. But we're all on the same team because we're all striving for the same thing. Now that I think is quite interesting from a leadership perspective because most organizations, in my experience, are still quite functionally based.
Hmm.
And unless your purpose happens to be absolutely aligned to your function, so your purpose is only about trying to get your finance team to work better, then actually you don't have that commonality of purpose with the rest of the organization. And that I think is going to be a real challenge for leaders to start thinking about flatter organizations where people come together for a an outcome based purpose as opposed to an input based purpose. And I was wondering what people's views were on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think the thing that's most important to pull this together and to get to common purpose is common vision. I think it starts with that, and I think the way to do it is through storytelling. So it's not enough to have a sentence on the back of a business card that says our vision is to be the best insurer in the world, and protect assets, across the globe, or all the kind of stuff that you see people put out as their vision statement. I don't think that's sufficient. I think it's got to be a story that's compelling, where people can see themselves being part of it, where they see themselves advancing as a result of achieving the vision. Um, and that's where purpose comes from, because now we're in it together, and some of it is actually ego driven. It's, I want to be part of this because it's good for me to be part of this.
Mm.
And one of the things I work on with clients quite a bit is translating their vision statement into a story, and helping them, craft a way, again, a compelling call to action, so that the guy sweeping the floor at night feels as if they're part of something really important and something bigger than themselves.
Really love that, Jim. That reference to storytelling is something, and Nick, I'm sure you can relate, that resonates very strongly with change and transformation, because we do take people on journeys. And I would say, we would all agree that we're in tremendous amounts of change. Not that it's new, it's just, again, more and faster.
Mhm.
I like this idea that you mentioned about kind of taking people along. And I think what that brings to mind for me is it's always great to establish our adventure together, why we're here, what we exist for, why we're together. But it's also really good as a touchstone when things are trickier, when
Mhm.
maybe things aren't going so well, and we need that
Mhm.
reference back to why we're here. You mentioned leaders coming to you with their challenges. Are they struggling with telling a story that is compelling, or ways in which they can, to your point, Nick, design teams, evolve identity, create belonging and purpose that we're talking about?
Mm.
Yeah, I think they are. I don't think it's necessarily a natural thing for people to learn. You're not really going to go to business school and be taught, you know, compelling storytelling. It might be an elective, but
Should be.
I don't think it's part of the core curriculum. And you know, as a result, we've got people that evolve into these top leadership spots with no sense of how to do that, how to pull people together, how to give them purpose, and so on. But, as soon as they start to recognize that that's an essential part of the job, then they start to look, how do I get that? Can I buy it? Can I rent it? How do I get the talent I need to be able to achieve it? And that's where folks, I think, like us come in, the consultants, advisors, coaches that, have that skill set and can bring it forward. And the thing I do, I mean, just with the vision story, just to take a little sidebar on this, it's a team building event in and of itself, because the way I do it is I don't walk in and say, okay, tell me what you're about, and I'll walk away and 2 months later come back with the story. It's more of, okay, tell me what you're about, tell me who's involved. Let's talk to all those folks that are involved and solicit input and help them express what they see and what their vision would be and what their aspirations are. So it can be weaved into a story. And when that story's delivered, if they can find themselves in it, if they can see the stuff they said as being part of the story, then the buy-in's already baked into the work product that I'm helping them create because it's their ideas, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I really like that, the buy-in. The other piece too that comes to mind, it creates that belonging as well that we're talking about,
Right.
right? A shared identity. But I like that you're pointing towards, this idea that it's not leadership of one. It's not a single role. It's leadership as many. And this view that you have collectively, right, of what that shared vision or that shared leadership mission is, I think, is incredibly important. Really like that.
mm,
Yeah, I was coaching somebody recently and I, you know, was listening to what she was lamenting about and how she felt like, people who were in leadership roles were making choices that weren't the best choices. And I kind of reminded her, I'm like, look, you don't need a title to lead, you know? And it was like I opened this, door that she didn't even realize, was locking her into a certain mindset. She opened that door and recognized, like, yeah, she can step up, she can take leadership responsibility, she can set direction, manage change, you know, drive behavior, just like someone who had an official title. And and it really helped her. She came back a few weeks later and said, that was, great advice, and I'm applying it, and I can't believe how easy it is, to do. And I said, well, you got to remember, and you guys may not agree, but I just think a lot of times people are lazy. So if someone's willing to step up and do something, then let them. It seems to be the attitude, and don't wait to be invited. Take
mm.
charge if you've got an idea and you think it's the right thing, it's consistent with the vision and what you're trying to achieve and part of the shared purpose, then do it. Don't wait.
Yeah, I think this is something which is becoming clearer to me too over the last year or so, that actually leadership, if it ever was a title, is not, it's a
Yeah,
behaviour. What's really stopping that behaviour from happening, I think, is our expectations, and based on our history and our culture and our tradition, that leadership comes from the top. When someone says you jump, you ask how high. It's all that sort of 20th century
right.
great man leadership from the top, and that really does seem to me to be something which is disappearing. And I think, as to tie this in with the 2 points which I've heard so far, one, Jim, was your point about vision and storytelling, and that ability to belong. Once you belong to something, I think you have an identity. You identify with that belonging. The story gives you the context within which you can actually do something. So belonging, leadership, visionary storytelling together allows people to step into leadership roles and behaviours which perhaps before they would have been reluctant to do so. To your point as well, Jim, about ego and not allowing people to move into those spaces, that's going to be the real challenge, particularly as you want people to be more dynamic, more inquiring, more courageous, more collaborative than perhaps they've had to be in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pull on a couple of those threads, Nick, I mean, if we're waiting for permission or if we've got to ask before we can take action, then it's going to take an awfully long time to execute. And by the time we get all the approvals and sign-offs and all this kind of stuff, the competition's already surpassed us. So in today's economy, with a dispersed workforce, back to some of the earlier themes in our conversation today, you don't have the time to do it. So you've got to enable people to make good choices right on the spot. You need to empower them and to be able to do that. and certainly train them up so that they're making the right call most of the time, right? We can't give somebody, a 12-year-old the keys to the car and say, go down to the corner store and buy a gallon of milk. It's just not a smart idea. But if we teach them how to drive, then we can give them that assignment and we can trust that they'll be able to pull it off successfully most of the time. So I think that's one really important theme that's out there, and I think another one that kind of again playing off the points Kimberly you were making, you've got to be able to have people use the vision story as a guiding light, as a North Star to help with day-to-day decision making. So if you've got a situation where you're not quite sure, there's a couple of three options that are in front of you, and you're not quite sure which one to choose, the easiest thing you can do is to review the vision and kind of see like which one of these different options are going to get me closer to achieving the vision for the organization. So we can make that vision story something that becomes a decision point or a decision screen that allows us to make the right call most of the time. And that's part of, again, you're training people up to use the vision story in that way so that they make the right call most of the time.
I think that's a great point. We had a session yesterday, interestingly enough, where we usually find ourselves, and I'm sure we would all agree that we tend to orient towards the work, the stuff that we do, right? The things that need to be done, the functions, Nick, as you called it earlier, and we took a moment, really, I think out of necessity. It's a driving, environment. A lot's been happening. It's change on change, and I think that's what we're talking about in terms of how we lead in these current environments as well. But what we did is we actually leaned into the values. So that North Star, Jim,
Mhm.
that you're talking about, just to reframe and also speak to the appreciation that people were practicing, that they were demonstrating the values, right, that underpinned this work that we're designed to do. So I appreciate your mention there about how it is a guide, if you will, for not just the what we do and how we do it, but why we're doing it, when we're in the
Mm.
dark sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff can all be driven from the vision, so if the story's, um, you know, um, complete enough, then the values just drip right out of it. Because if we're telling a story about how people behave and how they operate and how they do their jobs, those values are all built into that way you tell the
Yeah.
story. And, I think, uh, again, a lot of folks like to discount the value of a vision story because it sounds like motherhood and apple pie and all those kind of basic things that people can't argue with. But that's not what it is at all. The story that I might create for General Dynamics was much different than the one I created for Chase.
Mm.
And it's they both had vision stories. They both had people in the middle of the story, but the way we described how the work got done and what was important was very different.
I think it's interesting too. I think this idea of storytelling is probably we can work with that beyond the vision and the leadership dynamic too, because
Mm,
every team has its own stories.
right.
Every change has its own
Oh,
stories. Some of them I remember a wonderful one. I was working for an insurance company, and they had some new technology, and the message which went out is that actually if you use the portable printers we had in those days to print out paper versions, if you believe it or not, we still have paper versions. Then if you
mm,
use those in someone's house, you were going to get ink all over the place because they leaked ink whenever you took them out
mm,
of the bag. And there was no ink in these things; it was just a heat. thing, but the story about the person who went into this customer's house and spilled ink all over their white carpet was legendary. You couldn't go into a meeting without someone talking about ink on the carpet. And
Right.
so we all love stories. They're so pictorial. They're so dramatic. They're part of our. If you look back in history, we've passed on our knowledge and our beliefs about the way things are through storytelling. And
Sure.
I think that listening to the stories that come out from different parts of the organization is a wonderful way of actually really beginning to get underneath the skin of what they're saying to how they're feeling. And I find in change in particular, listening to stories is wonderful.
Sure. I mean, and to your point, that's how culture is framed,
Yeah.
right? So we can be physically apart, but still share a common culture. And it starts with sort of a common vision and the story behind it, and then the culture becomes how people behave to execute on the strategies and achieve the goals that are underpinning the vision, you know? So they're all kind of part of sort of this bold mosaic that is the organization. Its vision, its culture, its leadership, its behavior, and all that.
Mm.
So if we bring that back to, we were talking about, Nick, you mentioned, just where we are from a high tech perspective and, what's happening with AI and the challenges that we're facing around identity, and our need to put, humans in the loop, as we call it. One of the things that we're encountering is the importance as well while all this is happening. And I think we've said some great things about storytelling and culture making and identity is also how we are. And I would say where leaders might be challenged. I'm curious our thoughts about how we're creating higher value opportunities for our people as well. So
Mm.
as we are replacing, certain functions and tasks, and as we are telling these stories, in our environments, the really big conversations we're having and we're seeing some disparity in that, shall I say, is the ability for organizations at the level of leadership to be really on top of, even ahead of, and clear about what people are designed to do, kind of back to original point that you made, Nick, at the front of our conversation. Curious our thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if there was a question in there necessarily, Kimberly. I think it was a great observation. Yeah, that is the job of leaders, right? Is to be able to decipher all of that and come back with what their people need to do their best work. You
Mm.
know, it's being able to, if you're in the middle of the organization, you're translating the vision into something that can be achieved this year. If you're lower in the organization, say a supervisory level leader, you're translating that into something that can be done today.
Mm.
And depending on where you sit in the organization, your responsibility is a little different. Top leaders, the C-suite is worrying about where are we 5 years from now. A director level, VP level person might be again in the middle of the organization, and they're gonna be worrying about, can we achieve our goals for this year?
Yeah.
And like I said, the supervisor is worried about getting the work off the desk today. And it's a very different, time frames in mind
Yeah.
to do the job well. And um yeah, it's on the leader to figure out what that is and again give their people what they need to perform at their highest level.
And so I remember a few years ago I was working with a retail bank, and online banking was coming in, and there were going to be a lot of high street bank closures. And I went into a meeting where they had one of the executives meeting all the people who were about to lose their jobs or
mm,
have their jobs severely changed. And the question that someone asked is, well, how is this actually going to help our vision? Why are we doing this, basically, was the question.
mm,
And he said, we're going to do it because we need to improve shareholder value.
mhm,
Now, to the guys who were losing their jobs, who had been working in the local branch, sometimes many generations of the same family had worked there, they knew the customers personally. Shareholder value wasn't a story which they could relate to.
mhm,
But from his perspective, where he sat in the organization, his position was, of course, this is my tribe. These are the people who I need to keep happy.
right,
These are the people who matter. To the people at the other end of the organization, they were miles away from shareholders. What they cared about was the person who was disabled and didn't know how to use technology. And
mhm,
I think that one of the real challenges we have with technology, to your point, Kimberly, about what does this mean in practice, is how do we make those two stories align, even though we recognize that we've got different views. And to your point, Jim, about, are you looking strategically or are you looking operationally? We have to find a way, I think, of making sure that the narrative works for both groups because they are both going to be absolutely committed to their tribe, to the group that they identify with. And to bring a consistency of identifying and belonging across such a diverse group, I think is a real leadership challenge.
Really is. It just playing on that theme, Nick, is we're seeing almost to your point, in addition to kind of knitting that narrative together, almost a flip. Jim, you mentioned earlier, where knowledge could be living right in other pockets of the organization, not necessarily seated, say, with our most senior leadership.
mm,
Especially if we
mhm,
look at high tech. So that information is coming more from our front lines. Those line managers, those people
mhm,
who are right in those functional areas, and I would even say that what we're confronted with as we're enabling, these orgs, is a shorter strategic cycle, even, right? To
mm,
be responsive, more rapid, more connected to the pace of change, but also definitely more connected, I think is what you're getting at as well, Nick, to what's happening in these other tribes where they're holding data, where they're more proficient, where they are seeing, direct impacts of work that they're doing. And getting back to that earlier mention I made about leadership lag, where we're trying to bring leaders across the organization more facing forward, if you will, given some of the, we'll say, consequences of some of these decisions to acquire a tool, or a technology,
mm.
and obviously it's going well beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. I love the point you made, Kimberly, and I think the implication of what you're getting at is flipping the pyramid. When we think about Porter's pyramid, it was strategy was at the top, that's the C-suite. Tactical was in the middle, that's the middle management, and then the operational layer is the supervisory level. But, the pyramid was a great visual because it also denotes sort of volume. So the volume of people you have at those different tiers, lessens as you get closer to the top, where there's ultimately one CEO, right? So if you flip the pyramid and you start with the customer, which I think was one of the points you were making there, Kimberly, you're enabling that frontline staff because they're closest to the revenue source, the customer, right? So they become the most important asset in the organization, and we've got to invest there. And then the tactical layer is next, and then ultimately the servant leader is the CEO, you know? So I think flipping the pyramid becomes a really, you know, critical element for long-term success these days. It was always like a nice theory, but now it's an inevitability. Because if you're not responsive enough, I can find someone who is. If I'm a consumer,
Right.
I can get the service or the product I need readily. So again, I'm not locked in geographically like I was before.
And it's something that you're pointing to when I think of volume, it's shifting because, what's the volume of knowledge? It's about what we know and how we're using it.
Mm,
Right. So it's interesting the point that you make, Jim, about that pyramid and the idea that really seats people, size, scale, scope, if you will, of organizations
mm,
is necessarily shifting. And I think we've been in a knowledge economy for a while. It's just on steroids now.
Yeah,
mhm,
the idea of flipping the pyramid I really like. I guess if you connect that with the view about vision storytelling, then
mhm,
whose story are we telling?
mhm,
Is the vision that the customer has, the consumer
mhm.
has, which
Hmm.
is the one that should drive the behavior of the organization, and that I think is maybe a real lesson for leadership to actually stop trying to define what the organization is going to look like, but what the consumer's vision and story is.
Nick, the story you told earlier about the bank in during a period of transition, first of all, it's a terrific story, and it gets at that idea of like, where's the customer in the decision, you know? Um, but again, I mean, if we're leaving the top decision makers to sort of navigate to where we're going in the future, then it kind of doesn't matter that the um you know the person the disabled person who doesn't understand the technology is left behind. That, that that's just not going to be part of the equation, you know. We'll make the technology better and easier for that person, is the likely response to that observation, you know. But meanwhile, the local person working in the bank sees it every day and recognizes it's not that easy.
Yeah,
And now you're taking me out of the picture. You're going to lay me off here. So who's going to do the hand holding that I do every day?
yeah,
You, you know. Um,
that's
but
Yeah.
we can blame Citibank. I think they were the first ATM people. So
yeah, absolutely.
But I like that notion of, well, yeah, it's that relational piece, right? That we're at risk of missing,
yeah,
to our
yeah,
points as we're
absolutely. Yeah,
right. Yeah.
that's the
As we build
impact.
these better systems. Yeah.
Right. And I think that goes out with AI too. I mean, although interestingly, if you play around with some of this stuff, which I've been doing quite a bit in the last couple of years, the work I did with General Dynamics had a lot to do with the AI stuff and how to incorporate it into the product set that they've got, which, in a very scary sense is being weaved into weaponry. Um,
Yeah.
but the the reality of that stuff, though, in terms of AI in general, is it will compliment you. So it appears to have feelings like, wow, that was a great question, Nick. You know,
Yeah,
a brilliant observation, Kimberly, and you feel really good about it, but you recognize that they're also hallucinating. They're making stuff
That's
up.
right.
These models, these
yeah,
these massive data models are, if they don't have an answer, they create one, and it may not be accurate. So large language models, all the stuff that underpins the AI, um, you know, technology foundation is still, you know, void of any real human, emotion, and I don't think we can design it into the system.
I think we could talk about this for a long, long time. And maybe we need to bring you back, Jim, and we can continue this conversation.
Sure.
But I am
Yeah, I'd
aware
love
of the
to.
fact that we try and keep these things down to around about 30 minutes. I don't think anyone
Yeah.
will
I
have
think we
fallen
have
asleep
another
on this
three
one.
conversations that are
Right.
emerging here.
Yeah,
This could be
right.
good.
That's
Yeah. We'll make it a series.
absolutely. And
Great.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for such an interesting and thought-provoking conversation. And I think at this stage, given the fact that we are probably out of time, I'd just like to say thank you again, Kimberly. Thank you, And we'll see you next time on the Change Exchange.
Looking
Thanks.
forward to it. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jim.
thank you, and thanks for the challenging questions. It really made me think this morning. So now I need to go grab a cup of coffee so I can recharge my batteries here.